The first thing I'm going to do is take you through the most important buttons on the camera body. The first is the shutter button. This is a two-phase button. What I mean by that is it has two positions. The first is a halfway depression, and the second is a full depression, which will actually take the picture. You need to train your finger to feel where that first depression point is. It's a very soft click when you push down. It's almost like you're just breaking through a stress point or something. And if you push it down all the way, it'll take the picture. You need to train your finger to feel the sensitivity between these two positions. The second most important button is the main selection dial, and I also call this your primary selector. It's located directly behind the shutter button, and you will notice that it rotates to the left or right. The third most important selector is on the back of the camera, and you cannot miss it. It's a huge wheel. This is called the Quick Selection Dial by Canon, but I call this your secondary selector for a very good reason, which I will show you later. In the center of the secondary selector, we have the Set button, which will be used to select menu items. Just underneath the secondary selector, we have the Lock switch, and this will allow you to temporarily turn the wheel off to prevent accidental bumping. Otherwise, it needs to stay in the unlocked position if you want to make changes. The next most important dial, I would say, is the mode dial, and this allows you to control which mode you're shooting in. Out of all the buttons on the camera, you are going to use these four more than anything. I promise you that. Let's look at some of the other secondary camera buttons so you know what they are and what they do. Just to the left of the shutter button, we have the MFN button, which actually stands for your multi-function button. And it's best used when toggling through different focusing clusters. If you look on the opposite side of the shutter button, on that side of the lens, if you look halfway down, there's going to be an oval button, and that oval button is your lens release. You're going to press this every time you remove a lens from your camera body. Just below the lens release, we have the depth of field preview button. Its function is to close the shutter blades down so you can see the depth of field in real time. The button above the lens release is the Force Flash button. This is useful if you ever wish to force your flash to fire. Just to the left of the viewfinder, we have the One Touch RAW and JPEG button. It allows you to quickly kick in a second format to be recorded to your compact flash card. So say for example you're shooting JPEG and you want a RAW shot, just maybe one. So you press this button and the camera will temporarily record in both JPEG and in RAW. And then when you're done with the shot, it goes back to JPEG. Next we have the Q button, which will allow you to select and make changes to your camera settings on your main monitor. The menu button is a very important button, and you're going to be using it quite often. It will allow you to access the menu of the camera and tweak its settings. I've set up a special menu on the DVD as a way to quickly access any item you want to know. It's going to save you a ton of time, and it's a fantastic reference tool. Below the menu button, we have the Picture Styles button, which allows you to change the compression settings and appearance of your JPEG images. We're going to be discussing this in depth when we cover the menu. Pushing the Info button repeatedly will allow you to cycle through different types of shooting and playback information. I use it most when I'm inspecting my images to check out, the histograms, or if I just want to look at the shutter speed or the ISO information. To review images after shooting, press your playback button, and you can scroll through your images using your secondary selector. The button with the garbage can icon is the delete button, and it's going to allow you to delete images if you want. To the right of the viewfinder, we have the Live View Video Record dial. You have to pay attention to where that white tick mark is pointing. If it's pointing to the white camera back, pushing the Start-Stop button will activate Live View. If the dial is turned to the left, towards the red camera, pushing Start-Stop will activate Video Recording. We're going to be going over this more when we talk about video. The little teeny wheel that you see on the side of the viewfinder is your diopter adjuster. This will allow you to change the focus of the viewfinder if you wear prescription eyeglasses. Above the secondary selector, we have the directional controller, which I just call the joystick. You can move it up, down, left, right, and also in each of the four diagonals. You can use it as a set button by pushing it into the camera body. Near the top right of the camera, where your thumb would rest, we have 3 little black buttons. The first is your autofocus on button, which can be customized in different ways to help with focus. In live view, this is the primary way you will be activating autofocus. The middle button is your exposure lock button, or your flash exposure lock button if you are using a flash. This button allows you to lock your exposure, recompose, and take the picture without the camera remetering the scene. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. The third button is your autofocus point selector. It allows you to activate your autofocus points and choose which focus cluster you want. We're going to be talking about this in great detail in another lesson. Below these last 2 buttons, we have 2 small magnifying glasses. And what this means is that you can use these buttons to zoom in and out of pictures as we view them. These buttons will also help to zoom in and out when we're focusing in live view. If we look at the top of the camera, we see that we have 4 buttons in an LCD display. The LCD will show critical shooting information such as your shutter speed, your aperture, white balance, things of that nature, and you're going to be looking at it quite a bit. The 4 buttons are simple. The one on the far right is the LCD light, because sometimes it's going to be dark and you may want to see what you're doing, so press this if you need the LCD to light up. These last 3 buttons are critical to changing your camera settings. You'll notice that each of the buttons has 2 different icons below it. We will be talking about all of these settings and what they mean later on in the DVD, but for now, just learn how to select these different functions. The first button controls metering and white balance. The second button controls autofocus type and shooting drive. The third button controls your ISO and your flash exposure compensation. If you were to push any of these buttons, the first icon is changed with your primary selector dial, and the second icon is changed with the secondary selector dial. Now that's the same for all 3 buttons. That's why I call them the primary and the secondary selectors. Let's put this into practice. Say we're shooting and we want to lower our ISO setting. We will push the third LCD button to select ISO and then use the primary selector to change it. It's as simple as that. So that's an overview of the camera. We've gone over all the buttons and have briefly covered what they do. I promise that if you practice, the day will come that you will feel you have complete control over your camera, and it feels really good to know how to do everything. There may come a time when you forget which button does what. Just come on back and we'll go over it again. For the rest of the DVD, we will go through each of these settings individually so you know what they are and what they do. If you found this video helpful, you may be interested in my new DVD, Canon 7D Crash Course, which has over 3.5 hours of helpful lessons. I'll teach you the basics to get you started to great photography and video in no time. It can be ordered from the following link.